On today's episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez, my film review is Near Dark, followed by my segment Allow Me to Explain, and it all starts right now. This is Jordan Ramirez, and you are listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. And now, here is my latest film review. My film review for this episode is Near Dark, released in 1987, directed by Kathryn Bigelow, starring Adrian Pasdar, Jenny Wright, Lance Henriksen, Jeanette Goldstein, Bill Paxton, and Joshua John Miller. Here is the synopsis of the film. Caleb Colton, played by Adrian Pasdar, is a cowboy residing in Oklahoma, living on the ranch with his father and his sister Sarah. One day, as he is out with his friends, he sees a young lady walking outside, eating ice cream, and he suddenly falls in love with her. Her name is May, played by Jenny Wright, and she tells Caleb that she is unlike other girls. But Caleb cannot resist letting go of her and wants to be with her. As soon as they hang out, the dawn starts to rise and she cannot stay out very long. So, before she leaves him, she starts to kiss him and bites his neck. When Caleb decides to walk home since his truck does not start, he starts going through changes overnight, like the fact that he is suddenly feeling sick and his skin is burning in the sunlight. When he tries to come back home to the ranch, he gets kidnapped by the approaching Winnebago, and inside are a family of outlaw vampires. Their leader is Jesse Hooker, played by Lance Henriksen, and other members of the Vampire Outlaws include Diamondback, played by Jeanette Goldstein, Severin, played by Bill Paxton, and Homer, played by Joshua John Miller, as well as May. After the vampires find out that he has been bitten, or turned, Jesse makes an argument that he will give Caleb 1 week to prove that he can become one of them. Can Caleb escape the curse of being a vampire, or will he have to live his days of becoming one of them and live like an outlaw, and forget his own family and start a new life? So what do I think of this film? I had a blast watching this film. It is a blend of the classic Western and vampire genres that feels completely original. Because in traditional vampire films, it is usually the male vampire who turns the female victim into one. In this film, however, it is in reverse, in which Kathryn Bigelow plays with the traditional gender roles to make May more of a strong character, as opposed to Caleb, who was vulnerable and weak. Every character in this film was enjoyable to watch and look at. Jesse Hooker acts as the father figure and leader of the Vampire Outsiders. He also has that southern twang when you hear him speak throughout the film. Diamondback, the matriarchal character, feels like a femme fatale type who acts as a sort of sword and shield for Jesse Hooker in the film, even when he is in trouble. Severin is like the older brother who becomes wild and animated when he is on screen, and has some of the best lines in the movie. He is sort of like a scene stealer in a way. May is like an older sister who is sympathetic but also is very strong, in that she has to offer a lot of great opportunities for her character. Homer is the little brother character who was not a smart aleck type, but even though he looks young in the film, he acts older than his actual age in the movie. I admired much of the action sequences that were storyboarded and thought out by Kathryn Bigelow in the film, such as 1 or 2 shootout sequences, but there's one that takes place at a motel bungalow that exists later in the picture, and the use of slow motion that becomes part of her signature style and look that feels directly lifted from Sam Peckinpah and Walter Hill and other directors that she stylized in her films, to give it more of this artistic art house style mode. Even though it is a vampire western hybrid genre film, it also feels like an art house film when I watch it that doesn't utilize a lot of dialogue, and it makes it eerie and atmospheric. I admire her casting decisions, whom I thought it was a great choice to figure out who would play which role in this film. I felt that some of the best standout performances in the film came not just from Bill Paxton as Severin, but also the soft and subtle performances that came from Lance Henriksen, Jeanette Goldstein, Jenny Wright, and Joshua John Miller. Adrian Pasdar, I like him, but I feel he is a bit too unsympathetic and somewhat weak-willed in this film, but I appreciate his performance. I appreciate this as more of a feminist version of a vampire western hybrid genre that felt liberating and entertaining to watch and enjoy. The journey began when Kathryn Bigelow and writer Eric Red were working on two different screenplays. The first was a spec script called Undertow, which was later made in 1996 by director Eric Red. The second was this movie, Near Dark. The script was originally supposed to be a western, but she became fascinated with blending another genre that would make the movie stand out, and she chose the horror genre. So it became a western horror genre hybrid, and she ended up choosing the vampire genre since she was fascinated by it. She did research on it and the mythology surrounding this genre, and she decided that in order to make it contemporary, she decided to change the rules. Bigelow in the script writing process would remove any gothic or supernatural elements that would make it original and also make it simple and straightforward. When the script was completed, she needed to get the project financed so that she would retain control as a director of this film. Ed Feldman, the executive producer of the film, ended up getting the script from Eric Red, the co-writer. The production company which Feldman worked for was looking for low-budget properties that were completely original. Feldman was impressed with the script, along with another producer, Stephen Charles Jaffe. Feldman made a deal to see if she would impress him in 3 days to see if she could direct the film. If she was not successful, she would be taken off the picture. The last film she directed was The Loveless, released in either 1981 or 1982, depending on where you get your source material from, in which she co-directed with Monty Montgomery. This film would be her first project working solo. She would storyboard the sequences to get an idea of what her vision of storytelling was that impressed the producers of this film. One of the crew members who was brought on to work on this project was Adam Greenberg, who worked on the film The Terminator from 1984 for James Cameron. He was a well-sought cinematographer after his work on that film and was given a number of different projects to work on, and he ended up choosing this film. For the cast, the script was sent to Bill Paxton, who was completely hooked on the story and the outlaw elements as well as the fact that the vampires were contemporary. So Paxton called up Lance Henriksen, and he was originally not enthusiastic about the idea since they both worked on the film Aliens from 1986 for James Cameron. Paxton convinced him to read the script to think it over. The next day after Henriksen read the script, he was in on the project. Jeanette Goldstein, who was also in Aliens, was also excited about the project after she read the script. So in order to get the cast for this film, Kathryn called James Cameron to see if he was okay with allowing her to use his cast members for the film, and he was totally cool with it. Adrian Pasdar was at first uninterested in playing the role of Caleb. After he read the script, and Kathryn tried to coax him into giving it some thought. But it was the cast from the film Aliens that he was convinced that he had to do this film. Jenny Wright joined the cast of the film, as well as Tim Thomerson, who was cast in the film as Caleb's father, Lloyd Colton. According to AFI.com, in preparation for their roles, Bigelow had the actors portraying gang members perform timed blackout drills, in which they were required to work as a team to convert a given area into a sunlight-free space as quickly as possible. Before production began, Bigelow required the actors to practice with firearms their characters use in the film, end quote. According to Kathryn Bigelow, before production started, the locations and sets that were built in Oklahoma were destroyed by a flood, so they ended up relocating to Arizona to keep it on budget and on schedule. Production began on November 17, 1986, and ended in early February of 1987, with a budget of $5 or $6 million, again depending on which source you use. It was filmed during the snowy, cold winter season, since the film was supposed to take place during the midsummer. So, to give the illusion that it was set during the summer season and not having their cold breath shown on camera because this was before CGI and computers, they had to have a mouthful of ice to counter the steam of their breaths going against the cold air. This was for the cast members. While the majority of the film was shot in Arizona, some of the scenes, the opening, the barroom sequence, and the scenes outside Caleb's truck, were filmed in order: Coolidge, Arizona, Santa Clarita, California at Newhall Ranch, and Los Angeles. For the visual effects in the film, and I had to look this up, a portable smoke device was used to give the illusion of smoldering skin. Facial prosthetics were created for scenes in which a vampiric character had their face or arm burned by the sunlight. The smoke device was later tubed under the prosthetics to create the illusion of smoking, burning skin in their close-up shots. The smoking coming from the facial prosthetics and when Caleb was burning under the sunlight in the open fields came from a lit cigar that smelled putrid afterwards, with the yellowish nicotine juice building up underneath the prosthetics. That was for after 2 hours. Another prosthetic was made for Bill Paxton as Severin during one of the climactic showdowns that takes place near the end of the film that looked as if he had a gash on his face that was split open. The film was acquired by De Laurentiis Entertainment Group for the domestic rights. It was released at the Toronto International Film Festival on September 12, 1987. It had a New York opening on October 3rd of that year, and later a Los Angeles opening on October 9th that was also the nationwide date. While the film garnered positive reviews from critics, the film, however, was not a box office success. The film was released at the same time another vampire film was released, The Lost Boys, which was made by Warner Brothers. While that film garnered enough attention and press, Near Dark had little attention and press since it was an independent film and sadly it was overshadowed by The Lost Boys. The film, however, found new life when it was released on home video and developed a cult following, even to this day. It also received nominations at the Saturn Awards for Best Director, Kathryn Bigelow, Best Performance by a Younger Actor, Joshua John Miller, Best Supporting Actor, Bill Paxton, and Best Supporting Actress, Jeanette Goldstein. I will say that this is one of my favorite genre hybrid films involving horror and western that I think makes it one of the most original American films that I have ever seen. And even though Kathryn Bigelow would later get her recognition and due for her film The Hurt Locker from 2008 for Best Director and Best Picture at the Academy Awards in 2010, against her ex-husband James Cameron for Avatar from 2009, I feel that she deserves respect in the industry for her creative input as a storyteller and also for coming up with new methods and techniques that pays tribute to cinema in general. I feel that this film deserves its due for being a complete original that deconstructs two existing genres, but also inverting the gender roles from its main characters that makes it enjoyable to watch. And as I say it again, it is, in my opinion, a somewhat interesting feminist Western vampire genre hybrid that I think everybody needs to look at. We will be right back with Allow Me to Explain. The 2022 midterms are just 3 weeks away, so I thought it would be a good time for me to talk about this one group that needs to have some attention, and that is the youth vote. It may sound like I'm trying to pander to the youth vote, but in actuality, I'm exactly in that same age group between 18 to 30 years old. I think it is time to dissect what people really need to understand when it comes to young voters and what can be done to encourage them to vote and not leave them behind. It's time for Allow Me to Explain. When it comes to every election cycle, you would often hear from pundits on news media outlets that the youth vote is a monolith that would ultimately vote for one party during the midterm or general election. Well, it turns out that not every young voter is a monolith that will vote for just one party. There are different factions within young voters that do not get enough attention on enough news media outlets that they end up being bunched together like racial or minority groups. Well, when I was at Civic Influencers, I learned about how young voters should be reached as well as engaged in person and the different methods of how you can reach out to them, not just on social media, but get to meet them where they are, which I will explain in a little bit, that is relevant to any current situation in this political climate. You often hear this a lot. This election is the most important in our lifetime. Well, it may sound cliche, but it is in fact true. Young voters may be concerned about the economic factor, but there are also a lot of things that voters will lose if they do not focus on these other issues as well, even though the economic factor is not important, but I will get to that a little bit later. So I thought about focusing on the myths surrounding youth voters and what can be done to improve on this. This information comes courtesy of CIRCLE, which stands for Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. Myth number 1. Young people are apathetic. In actuality, they care about the environment surrounding their communities and peers on issues that they care deeply about that does not go addressed. The percentage of youth voters who convinced other young people to vote went from 33% in 2018 to 50% in 2020. According to Circle Research, youth civic and political engagement is strong and has a profound impact amongst young women, with a high voter turnout of 55% compared to young men at 44%. Myth 2. Youth voting has been declining for decades. Historically, youth voter turnout was low amongst baby boomers, Gen X, Y, and Zers during the presidential elections and every other midterm election. In the 2018 midterm election, however, there was an uptick of participation of young voters that was the highest turnout rate for a midterm election. That percentage during the 2018 midterm election was 32%. Myth 3. Young people just choose not to vote. It is not that young people just choose not to vote, it is because they face barriers to participate in these elections that are more structural. There are different reasons why they do not go out and vote. It's uneven and unequal civic education that ignores the principles of why they should vote and why their vote matters, political parties or candidates that often take them for granted or are ignored, media outlets that perpetuate the myths in which young voters do not participate in these elections or that they are not participants in a democracy. Other barriers also include the lack of transportation, long lines, no time off from work, absentee ballot requirements that are so confusing amongst out-of-state college students, voter suppression efforts, etc. Myth 4. Young people are all liberal college students. Young people in the current generation are the most diverse in American history, but it does not mean that young people are Democratic-leaning college students. While 25% of young voters are college students, 39% of young voters have no college experience. This year, we have 8 million eligible voters aged 18 to 29 participating in this year's midterm election. Myth 5. Young voters don't impact elections. It is incorrect to assume that young voters don't decide in the elections. It is also the lack of outreach that diminishes participation to the midterm elections in which young people do not show up to vote because they believe that their vote does not matter. It turns out that the youth vote is influential or decisive. The last midterm election in 2018 showed that young people were the driving force behind the key races in Wisconsin, Nevada, and Montana, especially among young voters of color. Some of the best talking points when it comes to young voters comes from this helpful article from Teen Vogue, and I will talk about some of the most important ones of what can be improved from this new report from Circle, also known as the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement at Tufts University. Reach out to us early and often. Campaigns would often target young voters via text message or on your social media platform. However, young people need consistent engagement before Election Day. The evidence from Circle indicates that young children in pre-K or elementary school should learn civic knowledge and skills that, as they get older, they will start to engage in politics and policy in the classroom. The same research from Circle suggests that teenagers in high school should be introduced to the electoral process by encouraging them to volunteer or register others to vote. Don't just focus on likely voters. Political campaigns focus on likely voters as their strategic outreach, while voters who are viewed as unlikely to vote are left behind. In 2020, half of the young voters were never contacted by a major political party or campaign. The young voters who did not go to college or school campuses are the ones with less outreach. Young voters' perceptions of who is likely to vote can end up changing who will actually vote if you reach out to those people. It doesn't start when people turn 18. Now, pre-registration is becoming a more common tool to motivate young people to vote before they reach the age of 18. In 2020, counties across the nation with a pre-registration system had a youth voter turnout rate that is 9 points higher than counties without a pre-registration system. Voting is habit-forming so that people, especially young voters, in their first few elections increases the odds that they will become lifelong voters. Pre-registration is only available in half of the states across the country. Local races get people personally engaged. According to data from 2020 in Circle, youth voter turnout was 11 points lower for states which mandated a civics exam before graduation. An alternative to this problem is for young people to be involved with politics at a local level, such as encountering state legislators up front. Sylvia Ward, a student at Brigham Young High School in Ohio, organized a panel with her state legislators and said, quote, "The school choir room filled with students one afternoon, and we saw our state lawmakers talk a lot about taxes and legal jargon, but also how those things apply directly to us and our school." End quote. It was that moment which convinced Ward that young people can make a difference in affecting state politics. Don't treat your relationship with us as a transaction. Young people may have limited knowledge on the electoral politics in our government, but it does not mean that they are gullible. They are able to see through these efforts as how to secure their vote. When creating outreach amongst teenagers, one thing that campaigns would do is to meet them at local community groups or at youth-focused organizations. According to the research from Teen Vogue, during the 2020 election, young people of voting age were 10% more likely to receive outreach from a non-youth-focused organization than one that works with young people. In 2020, that same year, more than a third of young people have said that they heard about an election from a community group. Newly eligible voters and Black and Latino voters were even more likely to say that they had been contacted by someone local. Meet us where we are. When it comes to meeting teenagers or young people, it is on social media. One has to think that when you are creating content on social media is that young people don't know everything. As one poll in 2020 shows that half of young people did not know if their state allowed online voter registration. One important note is that digital content will not always solve problems for young people. 82% of teens got their information during the 2020 election on social media, while 62% of the young people majority heard it from within their own family, and almost 50% received their information from local network television. Young people understand that they cannot just consume what is on social media when it comes to learning and engaged about voter outreach and politics, but also that they can create content on their own. According to Circle's report, more than half of teens who created at least one form of social media content said that they felt more informed about politics and felt their voice was more powerful as a result. It's about culture. If young people are in an environment in which they are listened to, then they are more likely to vote and share their own perspectives amongst their peers. From the Circle report, in our 2020 polling, we found that an overwhelming majority of youth said they believe young people have the power to change things. When creating a culture to encourage teens and young voters to learn about the voting process and how they can make a difference, often starts both at home and at school. Young people need a safe space where they feel open, what it means to vote, and how they can make a difference with their peers. A recent poll from the New York Times Siena College showed that inflation and the economy are on voters' minds for the midterm elections, and that Republicans lead Democrats in a generic poll 49-45. However, since I was a part of Civic Influencers, one of the best nonprofit and nonpartisan organizations across the country, I thought it fitting that I would give a shout out for the hard work that they are doing in motivating young people to vote to the polls. Maxim Thorne, CEO of Civic Influencers, was interviewed by Newsweek in the article entitled, "Could Gen Z Voters' Views on Issues Cost Republicans in Midterms?" The article states that while the economy ranked as the main concern in the New York Times poll, the poll conducted by Civic Influencers found that it only ranked 5th for youth voters. 31% ranked it in the top 5, and only 10% ranked it as the main concern. Thorne told Newsweek, quote, "Young people's values are quite different. What Gen Z is focused on is not what boomers have been focused on. There is a new zeitgeist for this generation, which is basically saying we don't accept the values of boomers. The main concern, according to the poll conducted by Civic Influencers, is the treatment of racial and/or ethnic minorities at 60%, followed by healthcare at 54%, the environment 51%, and abortion at 33%. Maxim Thorne again. They're not swayed by one-line nonsense like, the economy sucks. That is a meaningless thing. Am I going to be able to afford this particular thing? Am I suddenly going to get debt relief that frees me up? Some sort of abstract like the economy or the stock market is not affecting my particular life." End quote. Maxim Thorne proved that civic engagement organizations like Civic Influencers can reach out to young voters to tell them that their vote does matter and how they can flip a congressional seat. During the 2020 election, 12 of the 15 seats was flipped by a local campus enrollment. And I will finally leave some inspiring words from Maxim Thorne to sum it all up. It's not about getting behind a candidate, but getting behind the issues you care about. Candidates come and go. We have 4.3 million 17-year-olds who will turn 18 this year and next year. So this year alone, there are 8.6 million young people who could not vote in 2020 because they were too young. That is way bigger and more powerful for our democracy than getting behind a candidate." End quote. This has been Allow Me to Explain. You have been listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. This series is now available to listen to at 4 p.m. on Anchor, Spotify, and Google Podcasts every Friday. It is also on my blog website, filmtalkwithjordanramirez.wordpress.com, with my latest podcast episode on the page labeled Episodes. You can contact me on my social media feeds such as LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I am also available on Letterboxd. If there is a film that you recommend that I would put for my next review, make sure to submit it to my social media accounts. And until then, I'll see you at the movies.